He signed the divorce papers on a Tuesday morning, alone, in a parking garage in Nashville, Tennessee. His car still carried the last trace of the cologne his wife had bought him for their 20th anniversary. Thomas Hargrove sat behind the wheel with a gas station pen he'd grabbed on the way there. It took him less than 30 seconds to sign his name, but he didn't move after that. The paper rested in his lap. His hand stayed exactly where it was when he finished writing, like his body hadn't quite caught up to what had just happened. 45 minutes passed. No phone calls. No music. He was wondering how everything he had spent 2 decades building had come apart in less than a month. Because Thomas Hargrove hadn't just lost a marriage. He had lost his business, his savings, and the one man he had trusted like a brother. This is not just a story about a man who fell, though. This is a story about what happened after. About what a man who builds things for a living does when the people standing closest to him spend years quietly taking those things apart. Before we go any further, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We read every single one, and we genuinely want to hear from you. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button. Now, back to where Thomas Hargrove actually began. Thomas Hargrove was the second of 3 boys raised in Clarksville, Tennessee by parents who didn't have much and didn't make excuses about it. His father worked the railroads. Long shifts, hard labor, the kind of work that leaves permanent marks on a man's hands and a particular kind of stillness in his eyes. His mother cleaned houses on weekends. There was no inheritance waiting for Thomas. No family connections that were going to open a door somewhere down the line. What there was expectation. You showed up. You worked. You didn't cut corners because corners were for people who didn't care about what they were building. Thomas absorbed all of that before he understood what he was absorbing. Even as a kid, he didn't just fix things, he studied them. There was a kind of quiet focus about him that people noticed early. The kind that doesn't announce itself, doesn't ask for anything, but tends to get remembered anyway. By 19, he was working construction in Nashville. Long days, early mornings, learning from men who had been doing the same work for decades. He didn't complain. He didn't cut corners. He didn't leave until the job was finished properly. And people noticed that too. By 24, he had his own contractor's license. By 27, he'd hired his first employee. By 30, Hargrove Construction was pulling steady work across Middle Tennessee. Commercial retrofits, school renovations, municipal projects. No grand ambitions beyond doing the job right and doing it on time. In an industry where reputation is the only currency that holds its value across years, that was more than enough. He met Carol Beecham in the spring of 1992 at a Memorial Day cookout in Brentwood hosted by a mutual friend who neither of them stayed in contact with much after that summer. She was finishing her master's at Vanderbilt. She had a laugh that made people turn. Thomas noticed her before she noticed him. Spent 40 minutes working up the nerve to walk over. That detail alone tells you nearly everything you need to know about who he was. Careful. Not a man who moved until he was ready. But once he decided on something, he didn't look back. They dated 2 years. Married in June of 1994. 2 people who believed they were building something meant to last. Their daughter Lily came in 1996. Their son Marcus in 1999. And somewhere in those years, a life settled into a rhythm. A structure that looked, from every angle you could observe it from, like it was always going to be fine. Carol left teaching in 2001 to help run the back office of the business. Invoicing, payroll, vendor relationships. She was meticulous in a way that complemented Thomas's strengths exactly. He built things. She made sure the infrastructure around those things didn't fall apart. They were, by every measure that matters, a team. From the outside, there was nothing about Hargrove Construction or the Hargrove marriage that suggested anything other than 2 people who had figured it out. Which made what came next all the more complete in its devastation. Because the people who are most capable of undoing you are almost never the ones you didn't trust. They're the ones you trusted completely. And then there came Danny Beecham, someone Carol had known for years. When Carol introduced him, it came with quiet certainty. And for Thomas Hargrove, that was enough. Danny was 22 when he first came into the picture, which is to say he arrived with very little that could be measured. 2 lost jobs. No clear direction. What he did have was confidence. The kind that settles into a room and makes people feel like things are under control even when they aren't. Thomas hired him because Carol asked. First, Danny surprised him. He showed up early, stayed late, learned quickly. He wasn't built for the physical side of construction, but he understood something Thomas didn't. People. Where Thomas was structured, deliberate, more comfortable with plans and execution, Danny moved easily through conversations. He knew how to read hesitation before it became resistance, how to adjust tone, pace, and language depending on who he was sitting across from. Because in construction, the work matters, but the work doesn't exist without the contract. And the contract doesn't exist without the relationship. Danny began to build those relationships in a way that went beyond maintenance. He brought in opportunities Thomas wouldn't have reached on his own. Introductions that turned into projects. Projects that turned into repeat work. Over time, the numbers started reflecting it. By the early 2000s, the shape of the business had shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way that called attention to itself, but enough that if you looked closely, you could see where the growth was coming from and who was majorly driving it. Thomas handled the work. Danny brought in the work. It was clean, efficient. It made sense. And at a certain point, what Danny was contributing no longer looked like support. Carol saw it before Thomas said it out loud. If someone is already operating like a partner, then structuring the business that way is not a risk. Rather, it is alignment, like preparing for what the company is becoming rather than holding it back in what it used to be. By 2003, Thomas made the decision that would define everything that followed. He made Danny a partner. 40% of the company. Equity. Ownership. Thomas had walked it through the way he walked through everything. Structure, responsibility, division of roles. Danny would handle business development and client relationships. Thomas would maintain control over operations and execution. A system built on trust, but designed with clarity. On paper, it worked. In practice, it worked even better. What Thomas hadn't accounted for is what happens when trust becomes invisible. Because once that happens, it stops being trust. It becomes access. And Danny Beecham, somewhere between proving himself and being fully trusted, understood exactly what that access meant. By 2008, Hargrove Construction had grown to the point where Thomas couldn't personally oversee every operational decision. So responsibilities shifted. Danny picked up signature authority on certain accounts. Approval power up to a specific dollar threshold. Control over a dedicated operating account tied to a significant federal contract. Each piece, viewed in isolation, seemed like a reasonable adjustment for a growing business. Then the financial crisis arrived. 2008. Construction took the kind of hit that knocked entire companies sideways and left others simply gone. Thomas responded the way he always had. He adjusted. Cut overhead, chased government contracts, worked longer hours, pushed harder. It was the only model he'd ever had for dealing with a problem. Put your head down and build through it. What he didn't see, and had no particular reason to see, was that while he was grinding away trying to protect the business from the outside, someone on the inside had already decided that a crisis was a useful cover. A company called Midland General Services LLC had been registered in Delaware in 2007. The first payments to it were small, a few $100s redirected through a vendor account. Nothing that would trigger a question, just enough to test the system. When nothing happened, Danny did it again, then again, then again, each time a little larger, each time a little more confident. Because the thing Danny had understood about Thomas from very early on was this: Thomas Hargrove's greatest professional strength, his total, consuming focus on the actual work, was the exact thing that would make it possible for someone patient enough to take from him for years without being caught. Thomas trusted systems. Danny controlled the systems. By 2010, the pattern was established. By 2012, it was consistent. By 2014, when Hargrove Construction had not only survived the downturn but come out the other side with stronger contracts than it had before, Danny Beecham was diverting somewhere between 4 and 8% of gross revenue from those contracts into accounts Thomas had no visibility into, over 6 years, on projects totaling tens of millions of dollars. But the money, as it turned out, was only the beginning of what was being taken. On paper, everything looked exactly the way it was supposed to: growth, stability, momentum. But something had started to shift. Not in the numbers, not in anything you could point to directly, something quieter than that. Thomas noticed it the way people notice a draft in a room. You don't see it. You don't hear it. But after a while, you feel it. It started with small things at the office. Conversations that seemed to stop just a fraction too quickly when he walked in. There were always conversations happening in an office. That was what offices were for. But then it happened again. And then again. And once you notice something like that, you don't unnotice it. Danny still acted the same smile, same easy confidence, same way of making everything feel managed and under control. But there was a subtle shift in how quickly he changed subjects, how smoothly he moved past certain topics, how efficiently he redirected anything that got too specific. Thomas said nothing, because nothing was concrete. And Thomas Hargrove was not a man who acted on instinct alone. He needed something he could hold. At home, the change was harder to name. Carol had always been steady, one of the things Thomas had relied on most about her. She didn't fluctuate, didn't carry stress in a way that leaked out and disrupted everything around her. But sometime in early 2015, that steadiness developed gaps. She'd pause mid-conversation in a way that felt like she had stepped somewhere else for a moment. Thomas would say her name once, then again, and she'd come back. Apologize. Brush it off. Just tired. That was the explanation, and it was plausible. Life was full, the business was demanding, their kids were older now, which came with its own complexity. So Thomas accepted it. First. But then patterns started forming. Phone calls taken in another room, not often, just often enough to register. Errands that used to take an hour started taking longer. A new habit of setting her phone face down on tables. Individually, none of it meant anything. Together, it formed something that sat in the back of Thomas's mind and wouldn't leave. And he said nothing, because there's a moment in situations like this where speaking makes it real. As long as he stayed quiet, there was still a version of his life where nothing had actually changed. So he waited. He started paying attention in a way he hadn't before. To timing. To patterns. To the small details people don't realize they're broadcasting. He started looking at the numbers at work the same way. Pulling files late after the office emptied. Going through invoices line by line looking for something he couldn't yet name. What he found wasn't proof. It was friction. Vendor payments slightly higher than project scope justified. Expense lines that individually made sense but together created a low-level unease. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that justified action. Just enough to create a question that wouldn't resolve. He told himself he was overthinking it. That stress was making him see patterns that weren't there. He told himself that explanation held water. He told himself that right up until the night it didn't. It was a Thursday evening in late November. Marcus was out with friends. Lily was already at school. Thomas walked into the kitchen looking for nothing in particular. Just routine, just the ordinary motion of an ordinary evening. And there on the counter, half covered by a grocery bag that Carol hadn't finished unpacking, was a receipt. From the Lowe's Vanderbilt Hotel. One night. À suite. The date was 3 weeks earlier. Thomas stood at that counter for a while. His mind tried, at first, to find an explanation, a booking error, a work function, something that made sense. But the date was specific. That week, he had been in Murfreesboro overseeing a job. He remembered the week clearly. He could picture the site. He could picture Carol texting him that she was staying in that Tuesday evening. The text was still in his phone. He didn't need to check it. He already knew it was there. He folded the receipt carefully. Because he needed to control something, and that was the thing available to him. He placed it in his shirt pocket. Then he finished unpacking the groceries. One item at a time. Methodical, precise, exactly the way he approached everything else in his life. He said nothing that night. Nothing the next day. Nothing the day after that. 3 weeks passed. And in those 3 weeks, he stopped reacting and started watching. Over the next 10 days, Thomas collected dates, times, overlaps. And within those 10 days, something he hadn't yet allowed himself to fully articulate started to take shape. Carol wasn't just meeting someone. She was meeting the same person regularly, with a structure to it that made clear this was not confusion or impulse. It was a decision repeated and maintained. And that moved the question from whether something was happening to who it was happening with. The answer came from a project file that Thomas had reviewed dozens of times before without anything striking him as unusual. Vendor allocations, scheduling coordination, the kind of administrative document you scan and move past. But he was looking at it differently now, and when you look at something differently you see things that were always there. A recurring overlap, dates that aligned, times that matched, one name appearing more often than it had any reason to. Danny Beecham. Thomas dismissed it the first time the thought connected, because the alternative Carol and Danny didn't make sense in any version of reality he had been operating within. Couldn't. Not in any way that was consistent with what he understood about his life. But once the thought existed, it didn't leave. It started connecting other pieces. Danny's increased control over certain scheduling. His presence in locations at specific times. His unexplained availability during windows that now, in retrospect, aligned precisely with Carol's absences. And the pattern didn't just close. It locked. Thomas sat alone in his office that night, long after the last person had left the building. And for the first time he said it to himself clearly, without denial. Carol and Danny. The thought settled the way heavy things settle when they find their final position. Because once something like that becomes real, there's no version of the world available to you where it isn't. Thomas didn't move for a long time. Not because he didn't know what to do, because he did. And what came next wasn't going to be reaction. It was going to be strategy. He didn't go home that night. He stayed in his office until well past midnight, and when he finally did leave, he drove without direction for a while, letting the city move around him without really registering any of it. He had two things now: a confirmed personal betrayal and a growing suspicion about the financial side of the business. And he understood clearly that they were almost certainly connected. Danny's access, Danny's patience, Danny's years of operating just below the threshold of scrutiny, and Carol knowing or suspecting enough to be careful. The full shape of it wasn't yet visible, but the outline was. And Thomas had spent his entire professional life understanding how to read a structure before it was finished. The next morning he called Philip Gaines, a forensic accountant who worked out of an office on West End Avenue and specialized in financial investigations involving small and mid-sized businesses. Thomas had met him once at a Chamber of Commerce event years earlier and kept his card in a desk drawer for no reason he could have explained at the time. He told Philip he needed a full audit going back 7 years. He said he needed it done quietly, with no direct contact with the business, working only through Thomas's personal phone and personal email. He said he needed everything documented in a way that would hold up in legal proceedings. Philip asked 2 questions. Did Thomas suspect internal diversion? Yes. Did the subject of the investigation know it was happening? No. Then Philip said he could start within 48 hours and would need access to records staged carefully enough that nothing changed while he was working. Thomas said that was understood. That was the end of the call. He went home that evening, sat at dinner, carried on the same conversation he had been carrying on for weeks. And across from him sat the 2 people who had been dismantling his life, piece by piece, for years, and neither of them had any idea that the process of taking it apart had already begun in the other direction. Now, if you've been watching from the beginning and you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Because what Thomas does with what Philip Gaines finds over the next few weeks is where this story turns into something else entirely. 9 weeks. That's how long the audit took. 9 weeks of Thomas going to work, managing his crews, reviewing bids, answering emails from clients, sitting across from Danny in meetings and responding the same way he always had, while Philip Gaines quietly dismantled 7 years of financial architecture in the background. It was not an easy 9 weeks. Not because Thomas was struggling to maintain composure, He had spent his professional life learning to hold things steady under pressure. But because once you start a process like this, there's no relief until it ends. Every day was structured. Work during the day. Observation at home. Review in the quiet hours after Carol went to sleep. Danny didn't change. That was the remarkable thing. Same confidence, same ease, same way of walking into a room like a man who had nothing to answer for. He seemed, if anything, more relaxed, more certain. And Thomas understood what that meant. Danny believed his system was clean. He had built it carefully enough over years that he genuinely believed it couldn't be found. That belief, that comfortable certainty, was going to become the thing that destroyed him. Carol had started watching Thomas by the second week. Not the way Thomas was watching her. Not strategically, not with a process behind it, but with the particular unease of someone who senses that the silence around them has changed. She asked more questions than usual. Small ones. How was work? Everything okay with the new contract? Normal on the surface, but with something underneath them. A need for reassurance that Thomas couldn't provide without lying, and wouldn't provide while managing his own. He answered the same way each time, fine. And that consistency over time created its own kind of pressure. By the fourth week, Philip needed additional records, more detailed documentation, historical approvals, information that Thomas had to pull in careful segments to avoid raising questions. By the sixth week, a pattern had become clear in the numbers. Money had been moving in controlled increments, small enough individually to avoid detection, but accumulating in a way that had direction and intention behind it. By the seventh week, Carol's composure had started to show its edges. She was quieter, more withdrawn, not because Thomas had said anything, he hadn't, but because his silence had become heavier than any confrontation could have been. There were moments where she seemed like she was going to speak, going to explain something. Each time she didn't, and Thomas didn't ask, because partial truth at that point was worse than no truth. The call came on a Tuesday. "It's complete," Philip said. "Do you want to come in?" "Yes." The meeting was scheduled for the following morning. Thomas didn't sleep that night. Everything he had been building toward was about to become real. Philip's office was on West End Avenue, third floor. Philip met him at the door with a nod and led him to the conference room without small talk. The report was already on the table. Printed, bound, 214 pages. Thick enough that it didn't just represent information. It represented time. Thomas sat. Philip stood for a moment, then took the seat across from him. "I'll walk you through the summary," he said. Thomas nodded once. This was not random misallocation, he explained. This was structured diversion. He slid the first page across. Columns of numbers, dates, vendor names. Midland General Services, LLC. The name appeared repeatedly. A shell entity, Philip said. Registered in Delaware. No operación el footprint. No legitimate project history tied to your business. How long? Thomas asked. First instance, 2008. Thomas didn't react. He nodded slightly and waited. There were 2 additional entities, Philip continued. Similar structure, different names, same pattern of use. Funds routed through vendor payments. Justified as subcontractor costs. Embedded within projects with high invoice volume. Then the total. Confirmed diversion between 2008 and 2015 of approximately $1.4 million. Then Philip turned to a different section. Evidence of direct contact, within the last 12 months, between Danny Beecham and 2 of Hargrove Construction's largest municipal clients. A newly incorporated entity called Beecham Building Group. Thomas looked at the heading. He was preparing to replace the company, Thomas said. Philip nodded. That appears to be the case. Not just taking from the foundation, rebuilding the replacement in parallel. Using the same clients, the same relationships, the same market position Thomas had spent decades establishing. And then Philip turned to one more section. He was careful with his words here. Some of the financial documents, he said, include secondary sign-offs. Not primary authorization, but present. Thomas looked at the page. A familiar signature. Carol. Philip added quickly. There was no evidence she had initiated or managed any of this. But her name appeared in enough places that it raised questions. Thomas nodded, because the question had already existed for him. Now it had weight. Thomas walked out of Philip's office with the report under his arm and stood in the parking lot for a moment. He got in his truck, placed the report on the passenger seat, and sat for a moment thinking not about what had been taken, but about what came next. The taking was finished. What remained was control. That evening, Thomas drove to the house. Not to confront, not yet. He told himself he needed to pick something up. But what he actually needed was to see it again now that he understood what it actually was. Carol was in the kitchen when he walked in. She looked up, surprised. "You're home early." He told her he needed to pick something up. She accepted that without follow-up. And that told him exactly what he needed to know. She wasn't expecting change yet, which meant Danny wasn't either. He had time. He walked through the house, picked up a folder of old contracts from his office that he didn't actually need, and left. When he came back out, Carol watched him for a second longer than usual. "Everything okay?" she asked. Thomas looked at her, and for the first time since all of this began, there was no attempt to reconcile what he was seeing with what he had believed. "Yeah," he said. "Everything's fine." He left a few minutes later. Because the next time they spoke about any of this, it would not be a conversation. It would be a conclusion. 3 days later, Martin had the filings ready. Thomas reviewed them line by line, every section, every claim, understanding exactly what each document would trigger once submitted. This was no longer a situation. It was a sequence of events that he was about to set in motion, and once started, it would not be stopped. He signed the authorization that afternoon. Martin filed in Davidson County Circuit Court the following morning. The criminal referral package went to the district attorney's office at the same time. 2 parallel tracks, both built on the same foundation. Evidence that couldn't be reinterpreted once seen. Danny found out before the end of that first day from his attorney. That's how these things work. By the time the person involved becomes aware, the structure is already in place. There's no chance to quietly move assets or reshape the narrative before it becomes public record. Thomas was in his office when Danny came in. The door opened harder than usual. "What is this?" The words were controlled, but the control was thinner than Thomas had ever heard from him. Thomas just looked at him. "It's what it looks like," he said. Danny held his gaze, trying to find uncertainty. There was none. He tried to push further. "You're blowing this out of proportion. There were just timing issues." Thomas shook his head. "No," he said. "Nothing else." For the first time in the years Thomas had known him, Danny had no confidence left in his expression. "What do you want?" he asked. Thomas looked at him steadily. "Everything back, and you're out." Danny let out a short breath that was almost but not quite a laugh. "You think it's that simple?" Thomas held his gaze. "It is," he said. Danny stood there for a moment longer, then turned and left. And that told Thomas exactly what he needed to know. Danny wasn't going to fight emotionally. He was going to fight strategically, through lawyers, documents, negotiation, and pressure, which meant the next phase would move exactly the way Thomas expected it to. That afternoon, Carol called. She'd heard about the filing. Of course she had. She asked why he hadn't told her. Thomas said, "You already knew enough." Silence on her end. She said she hadn't known about the money at the beginning. He asked when she'd found out. She said last year, maybe a little before. She wasn't sure exactly when it became clear. Danny had framed it carefully when he told her. Irregularities he was managing, nothing serious, nothing Thomas needed to know about. Bringing it up would only destroy the business and everything Thomas had built. He had used her love for Thomas as the instrument to keep her quiet about what he was doing to Thomas. Thomas absorbed that. He asked about the rest of it, the part that wasn't about the money. Carol's voice dropped. She said it hadn't started the way Thomas probably thought. Thomas said, "It didn't just happen." She said she knew how it sounded. He said he knew what it was. She said she'd ended it the night she found out everything. Thomas didn't ask for details. He asked how long. She was quiet for a moment. Then, over a year. The length of it removed the last remaining ambiguity. This wasn't a moment or a mistake. It was a sustained decision, maintained and hidden across 14 months of ordinary evenings living in the same house. And during that time, Thomas said, you were sitting across from me every night. Carol didn't respond. Is there anything else? Thomas asked. And that hesitation, that pause before she answered, told him there was. There was a document, Carol said. Danny had asked her to sign something a few weeks earlier. Told her it was routine, an adjustment to the business structure. She hadn't read it carefully, but something about the way he'd asked her, something in his manner that day, had made her uneasy enough to keep a copy. She wasn't sure why. Thomas told her to bring it. She brought it the next evening. She stayed in the driveway, engine running, and handed it through the window without coming inside. Thomas scanned it once, then again more slowly. Amendment language, transfer language, designed to look routine to someone who wasn't looking for what was actually there. If signed and recorded, it would have shifted Carol's community property interest in Hargrove Construction, the interest she held as Thomas's spouse, directly to Danny, giving him consolidated control of the business at precisely the moment he needed it to execute the final phase. Danny had been planning to use Carol's own position to complete the takeover. Carol had not signed it, and the copy she'd kept would become, in Martin's hands, one of the most consequential pieces of evidence in the entire case. Martin read it carefully when Thomas brought it in. Once, then again. When he finished, he exhaled through his nose. This establishes intent beyond the financial activity, he said. It shows preparation for structural takeover. If this had been executed, it would have positioned him to control the business before any dispute surfaced. It also, Martin added, strengthened the case considerably, because it showed that what they were dealing with wasn't isolated opportunism. It was coordinated, designed with a specific endpoint in mind. Thomas told Martin to add it. Martin said they would, and that it would accelerate everything. They'll want to settle now, Martin said. Thomas said he wasn't interested in negotiation. Martin said they would proceed accordingly. Danny's attorney reached out within days of the document being added to the file. Controlled tone, but the intent was clear. Contain the damage and find resolution before it expanded further. Thomas let Martin handle it. He didn't attend the early calls, didn't respond to initial proposals, because involvement creates openings, and Thomas wasn't interested in creating any. The offers that came back were partial, attempts to resolve one piece without addressing the whole. Martin rejected them consistently, until Danny's side stopped trying to limit the damage and started trying to end it. The shift came gradually. Danny stopped coming into the office, stopped attending meetings, stepped away from everything that required visibility. Thomas didn't acknowledge it. Absence speaks clearly enough on its own. The offers that followed were larger, more structured, with assets brought into the conversation and the direction clearly moving toward a single destination. Resolution on Thomas's terms. The civil settlement came in June 2016. Danny relinquished his 40% interest in Hargrove Construction in full. He agreed to repay $1.1 million in confirmed misappropriated funds on a structured schedule secured against personal assets. Beecham Building Group was dissolved, and Danny was prohibited from competitive contact with Hargrove Construction's client base for 5 years. As part of the settlement, he cooperated with the criminal investigation. That cooperation bought him a plea arrangement in October 2016. A felony fraud conviction, 4 years of probation, a substantial fine. No prison time. Thomas, when Martin told him the outcome, said only that recovering the business was what mattered. He was being honest, but he was also not telling the complete truth. Because what had mattered most to Thomas, more than the judgment or the money, was something no court had the power to answer. The divorce moved without dramatics. Thomas and Carol didn't attempt reconstruction. They didn't go through the motions of people still deciding whether something can be saved. That decision had already been made sometime in the weeks before the filing. They met once to go through the terms. At the house, The same kitchen where they had spent 22 years of ordinary evenings building something that had felt, at the time, like it was built to last. Now it just felt defined, contained. Like something that had already ended before the paperwork caught up to it. Carol spoke less than Thomas expected. Not defensive or not argumentative. There were moments where she seemed like she might say more, try to explain something beyond what had already been said. She didn't. Thomas didn't ask her to, because explanations don't change outcomes. They only change how you remember them. The house stayed with Carol. Thomas kept full ownership of the business and a financial arrangement that, combined with what the civil judgment had recovered, left him in a position to rebuild from solid ground. The same way everything else had been handled, deliberately, without excess. The day it was finalized, Thomas didn't mark it. He went to work, because work was the only place left where cause still led reliably to effect. Danny's office had been cleared, his name removed from every system, access revoked. Staff asked questions at first, carefully phrased, indirect. Thomas answered the same way each time. He's no longer with the company, and eventually the questions stopped, because the business kept moving and continuity replaces curiosity faster than people expect. Thomas rebuilt the internal structure from scratch, by redesigning the system entirely. Checks where there hadn't been checks. Separation where there had been consolidation. Not because he expected it to happen again. Because he understood now, at a level he hadn't before, that it could. And understanding that changes the way you build everything that comes after. He hired carefully. Experience mattered, but so did pattern. Consistency, history, a background that verified exactly what it claimed. Sandra Pell joined 6 months after the settlement. 20 years in commercial construction management. No gaps in her record. She replaced the system Danny had operated within. By the end of the first year, the business had stabilized. Not recovered, stabilized. Because recovery implies returning to what was, and this was something else. A new structure, built with different assumptions. By the second year, it grew. In 2017, Hargrove Construction was awarded the largest single contract in its history. An $11 million public works renovation for Metro Nashville and Davidson County, spread across 3 years. Thomas hired 42 people to complete it. He opened a second office. The business that Danny Beecham had spent 8 years systematically trying to hollow out and replace was, 3 years after Danny's exit from it, stronger than it had ever been at any point in its entire existence. Danny moved to Chattanooga eventually. Beecham Building Group never completed a single contract. In 2018, he filed for personal bankruptcy. The repayment obligation to Hargrove Construction, which he'd fallen behind on within the first year, was restructured in the proceedings. Thomas collected a portion of what was owed. The rest was written off. He was asked years later how he felt about that outcome. He said he'd spent exactly one evening thinking about Danny after the bankruptcy filing. Driving back from a job site in Franklin, he'd taken the long way home, through the neighborhood where he and Carol had bought their first house, where Lily and Marcus had grown up, where he had believed for a long time that he was living the life he'd intended. He stopped the truck, sat for a few minutes, then drove home. He didn't say anything else about it. Carol went back to teaching. 8th grade English in Green Hills. Rebuilt quietly, without announcement, without any kind of public accounting. Just the gradual adjustment of a life that had to reconfigure itself around what was true. She and Thomas see each other occasionally, at their children's events, at family milestones. Never alone, never long, but without hostility. Just distance. The kind that is defined and accepted rather than managed and negotiated. Their children found their own ways through it. Lily finished school, went into commercial real estate in Nashville. Marcus, 25 at the time of this telling, works in project management at Hargrove Construction. He chose it himself. No one asked him. People who work with him say he has his father's focus. Thomas Hargrove is 57 years old. He runs the company he built. Gets up at 5:30 every morning. Drives a truck that isn't particularly new. He doesn't carry what happened to him in a way that bends him, or if he does, it doesn't show from the outside. He carries it as context. as something that exists in the background of how he makes decisions, rather than in the foreground of how he lives. He became, the people who know him well say, more precise. Not harder in a visible way, not colder in a way that anyone could point to directly. About what he trusted, about what he allowed, about what he built from that point forward. And that precision became the thing that protected everything else. There's a version of this story that people expect. The one where anger takes over, where everything explodes. That's not what happened here. Thomas Hargrove didn't raise his voice. He didn't chase explanations. He didn't try to pull something broken back into place just to prove that it could still hold. He understood it, and once he understood it, he removed himself from it, piece by piece, until there was nothing left that could touch him in the same way again. Because betrayal doesn't always destroy you, but it does change what you assume, what you accept, what you overlook. And once that shift happens, you don't go back. He gave one interview about this to a Nashville business publication a few years after everything settled. The journalist asked what he wished he'd understood sooner. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, that the people most capable of hurting you are almost never strangers. This forces a question. Not about what happened to him, but about what happens to you when something like that becomes real. Before we close out, we want to hear from you. Not just where you're watching from, though tell us that too. We want your honest take on this one. Do you think Carol made the right decision by staying silent for 8 months? Was she protecting Thomas? Or was she protecting the version of things that was most convenient for her? Is there even a difference? And if you were in Thomas's position, would you have handled it the way he did? Or would you have done something different? There are no wrong answers. Drop it in the comments. I read all of them. If this one hit you in some way, if it made you angry or sad or quietly satisfied, share it with someone. The best thing that can happen to a channel like this is someone turning to the person next to them and saying, "You need to hear this." Next time on Wounds and Warnings. A woman in Portland, Oregon discovers that the man she spent 17 years building a life with had been living an entirely separate one just 40 minutes away. Not an affair. Something far more shocking than that. And far more calculated than most people will see coming. Subscribe so you don't miss it. This has been Wounds and Warnings. Every betrayal has a story. Every story has a reckoning.